The neon lights of Voreth Station flickered in the artificial haze of recycled air. It wasn't an uncommon sight. Most of the sprawling hub was a patchwork of alien technology cobbled together to support thousands of species from across the galaxy. Ethan Kane stepped off the grimy transport dock, pulling his jacket tighter against the cold metallic air. He wasn't here by choice. No one came to Voreth unless they needed something, or had nowhere else to go. For Ethan, it was the latter. The human scavenger blended into the crowd of multi-land traders, insectoid merchants, and cloaked figures with glowing eyes. He had no particular destination, just a handful of credits and a knack for finding trouble. As he weaved through the marketplace, he caught fragments of conversations in languages he didn't understand, smelled spices that burned his nose, and avoided the ever-watchful security drones hovering overhead. But then he heard something strange. A sound cut through the chaotic noise of the marketplace, a cry, high-pitched and haunting, unlike anything he'd ever heard. It wasn't mechanical or animalistic. It sounded alive. Ethan stopped in his tracks, his heart racing. The sound came again, faint but unmistakable, a cry of desperation. Curiosity pulled him forward. Ethan followed the sound, his boots clicking softly against the station's metal floor. It led him deeper into the station, away from the bustling crowds and into the darker, quieter sections where shadows grew longer and the air felt heavier. Finally, he found himself in front of a heavy steel door, marked with glowing red symbols. The sound was coming from inside. He hesitated, glancing around. The corridor was mostly empty, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Gathering his courage, Ethan pressed his ear to the door. The cry came again, clearer this time, and he swore he could feel the pain in it. "What's behind here?" he muttered to himself. A gruff voice answered from behind. "None of your business, human." Ethan spun around to see a towering alien with scaly skin and 3 glowing eyes. The alien, clearly a guard, crossed its arms and glared down at him. "I thought this was a public station," Ethan said, forcing a casual tone. "Just curious about the noise." The guard snorted. "Curiosity gets you killed here. Move along." Ethan raised his hands in mock surrender and backed away. But he didn't leave. He waited until the guard turned his attention elsewhere, then slipped into the shadows. Years of scavenging had taught him how to move quietly, how to avoid attention. He found a maintenance hatch nearby and climbed inside, navigating the narrow, claustrophobic tunnels that ran behind the station's walls. The cry grew louder as he crawled closer to the room. Finally, he peered through a small vent, and what he saw made him freeze. Inside the room was a cage. The cage wasn't like anything he'd seen before. Its bars were made of a glowing, pulsing energy, and within it sat a girl, or at least something that looked like a girl. Her skin shimmered with an ethereal glow, shifting between shades of green and blue. Her eyes were impossibly large, filled with tears that reflected the faint light around her. She looked fragile, small, but there was something about her that felt powerful, almost otherworldly. She clutched her knees to her chest, her cries quieting into soft whimpers. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. "What in the stars?" he whispered. The room wasn't empty. Several aliens surrounded the cage, discussing something in harsh, guttural tones. Ethan couldn't understand their words, but their body language was clear: anger, greed, and a sense of ownership. "She's a prisoner," Ethan realized, his fists clenching. He didn't know why, but the sight of her struck a chord deep within him. The galaxy was a cruel place. He knew that better than anyone. But this felt different. This wasn't just cruelty. This was wrong. He couldn't just walk away. Ethan's mind raced. He had no weapons, no backup, and no plan. But he knew one thing. He had to get her out of there. The girl's eyes suddenly lifted, as if she could sense him watching. For a brief moment, their gazes met through the vent. Ethan felt a jolt, like a silent plea reaching out to him. "Hold on," he whispered. "I'll figure something out." Sliding back into the tunnel, Ethan's jaw tightened with determination. He didn't know who she was or why she was here, but he knew one thing for certain. Her screams wouldn't go unanswered. Ethan moved swiftly through the service tunnels, his mind racing with possibilities. Every step echoed softly against the metallic walls, but he ignored the sound, focusing only on one goal: freeing the girl. Kalira. That was her name. He had to find a way to outsmart her captors before they realized she was gone. They wouldn't take kindly to losing their prize. The station was vast, and Ethan knew every second counted. His experience as a former soldier turned scavenger helped him navigate the twisting corridors without a trace. Yet, the weight of responsibility grew heavier with every step. He couldn't afford mistakes. After what felt like hours, Ethan found a less used section of the station with fewer guards. He knew he had to make contact with the alien traders who had captured Kalira, those who sought to exploit her immense otherworldly power. He couldn't simply walk in and demand her release. They'd laugh at him, throw him out into space with no second thought. Instead, he needed a different approach, a gamble. Returning to the room where Kalira was held captive, Ethan devised a plan. He would offer them something they couldn't refuse, a deal too good to pass up. His former military training had sharpened his instincts, and he trusted in his ability to think on his feet. Back in the chaotic marketplace, Ethan made his way toward the section where the traders gathered, an elevated platform where deals were struck in hushed voices under flickering neon lights. The air buzzed with tension, and every alien seemed to watch one another, wary of betrayal. Kalira's captors stood there, their towering forms imposing as they bartered over rare artifacts and dangerous technology. Ethan approached cautiously, keeping his head down but moving deliberately. One of the captors, a creature with elongated arms and sharp mandibles, glanced at him and sneered. "Human, I have a proposition," Ethan said calmly, his voice steady. "Something that could benefit both of us." The traders exchanged glances, amused. "Speak," the creature said, voice smooth and almost amused. Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat. "You want power, real power. He nodded toward the cage, is a living weapon. But she's more than that. She's a key to something much bigger." The trader's eyes flickered with interest. "Go on," one hissed. "I've seen her abilities firsthand," Ethan continued. "But I know how dangerous she is to control. Instead of fighting over her, why not let her wield her power freely?" A low rumble of discussion began among them. Ethan pressed on. "I can give her a purpose, a way to harness her abilities without anyone controlling her." The traders hesitated. Then a tall, dark-skinned alien stepped forward. His voice was steady, calculating. "You speak of freedom for her." "Yes," Ethan met his gaze. "Freedom to use her powers without being a tool for someone else's gain." The traders exchanged another set of whispers, this time more thoughtful. It was a dangerous proposition, but the idea of a weapon who operated without strings was appealing. Finally, after a long pause, the leader spoke. "What do you want in return?" Ethan knew this moment would come. He had no illusions about winning without cost. "Protection," he said, "for both of us. She will not be a threat to you or the station. And in return, I'll ensure no one else takes advantage of her." The leader's eyes gleamed with interest. "You speak boldly, human." "I'm offering something valuable," Ethan replied, his voice firm. "Something you can't just sell off or destroy." The group discussed in low tones again, debating the merits of the deal. Ethan could feel their unease, but his determination held firm. He wasn't backing down. After what felt like an eternity, the leader finally nodded. "You've intrigued us, human." Ethan exhaled softly, a small smile crossing his face. "Then let's free her." The cage hummed softly as the energy barriers flickered and disappeared. Kalira stepped out, weak but grateful. Her eyes locked onto Ethan, a silent thank you passing between them. The traders gave one last glance before turning away. The deal was done. "You've bought her freedom," the leader said coldly. "But know this, You will always owe us, and she will always be under our watch. Ethan gave a slight nod. Fair enough. Kalira took Ethan's hand in hers, and together they turned away from the traders. For now, their journey was just beginning. The station was no longer safe. Ethan knew that as soon as Kalira stepped out of the cage, the sound of alarms could be heard faintly in the distance, growing louder by the second. The traders had realized their prize was gone, and their search had begun. Ethan moved swiftly through the narrow corridors, guiding Kalira by the hand. Her steps were unsteady, her body weak from her prolonged imprisonment. The energy barriers had drained her more than either of them had expected. Yet, her will remained strong, her determination unwavering. We have to move faster, Ethan urged, glancing back over his shoulder. They'll send more soon. Kalira nodded slowly, her eyes darting around as they slipped through a side passage. Her luminous skin glowed faintly, casting a soft light in the dim, twisting tunnels. It wasn't just a physical glow. It was something deeper, something ancient. Ethan could feel it, even without understanding what it truly meant. I can feel them, Kalira whispered, her voice barely audible. They're searching for me. Ethan squeezed her hand gently. We'll find a place to hide, then figure out what's next. They kept moving, weaving through the shadowy paths of Forth Station. The air grew colder as they descended deeper into the station's underbelly. The higher levels had been crawling with aliens and guards, but here it was quieter, less populated, but not without danger. We'll need a ship, Ethan said, thinking aloud. One we can fix up and escape with. Fast. Kalira's gaze drifted to his face. You've done this before. Ethan smiled faintly. A few times. The escape wasn't without its challenges. Every corner turned was another gamble. More corridors meant more enemies. The station wasn't built for humans or Zithari, and Kalira's powers would only get them so far. It was clear they'd need more than instinct to survive. As they rounded another corner, Ethan spotted a maintenance access point to an old freighter dock. The sign was faded, the symbols worn, but it looked like the perfect place to hide, a forgotten corner of the station where few ventured. Here, he whispered, gesturing for Kalira to follow him. They crouched low, moving swiftly through the maintenance hatch. Inside, the dock was a mess of rusting metal and ancient wiring. The ship sat in a corner, covered in dust, its engines quiet. Kalira stepped closer, her fingers tracing the ship's exterior gently. This ship, it feels different. Ethan glanced back at her, raising an eyebrow. Different how? It hums, she said softly. Not in the way it should, but in a way that resonates with me. It's old, but it's alive. Ethan studied the freighter carefully. It had seen better days, but if it could move, that was all that mattered. Let's get it running. They worked in silence, their breaths quiet and measured. The docking systems were ancient, and it took time to bypass the security protocols. But Ethan knew what he was doing. His hands moved with precision, fueled by urgency. We don't have long, he muttered, frustration creeping into his voice as the systems refused to cooperate. Every second we waste. They're closing in. Kalira sat quietly on a nearby crate, her eyes distant as she concentrated. She extended her hand slightly, and the air around her shimmered. A small pulse of energy shot out, activating dormant circuits in the ship's controls. The lights flickered on, dim and flickering, but alive. Ethan's heart quickened at the sight. It's working, Kalira said softly. Ethan smiled in relief. Good. Let's finish this and get out of here. As they prepared the ship for launch, Ethan's mind raced through possible routes. The station's layout was vast, with countless patrols and blind spots. They needed a path out, something no one else could predict. Where do you want to go? Ethan asked, glancing over at Kalira. Anywhere in particular? Kalira shook her head slowly. Anywhere far from here. A place where I can be free. Ethan nodded. Then let's make it happen. Just as they were about to take off, alarms blared through the docking bay, a shrill, piercing noise that made the ship shudder slightly. "They found us," Kalira whispered, her voice tense. "Hold on," Ethan shouted, slamming his hand down on the controls. The ship jolted forward, leaving the station behind in a blur. The pursuit had begun. The hum of the ship's engines vibrated through the cockpit as Ethan steered them away from Vorith Station. The air was tense, and the flashing warning lights on the console painted the dim interior in a frantic rhythm. "They're still on us," Ethan said, his voice calm but focused. His hands moved smoothly over the controls, adjusting their trajectory, while Kalira sat silently beside him, her gaze fixed on the starfield outside. Kalira's mind was clouded with exhaustion, but the weight of the moment kept her alert. Every second counted as their small freighter sped through the asteroid fields near Vorith Station. The narrow pathways between floating rocks and debris gave them a slight advantage, less predictable paths for their pursuers. "We can't keep this up forever," Ethan said, his eyes darting to the sensors. "They've got faster ships." Kalira looked at him, her expression calm yet determined. "Then we'll make them chase us through the void." Ethan smirked slightly at her resolve. There was something unnerving about her, something beyond her powers, an untapped force, a quiet confidence that radiated from her even in the face of danger. Suddenly, the scanner beeped urgently. A flicker of movement caught Ethan's attention. "They're splitting up," Ethan said quickly. "3 groups. We need to keep our distance." Kalira leaned forward slightly, her fingers brushing the console lightly. Her power stirred beneath her skin, and a low hum reverberated softly through the ship's hull. "What are you doing?" Ethan asked, glancing at her. Kalira didn't answer immediately. Her eyes glowed faintly, and the ship's systems responded. The navigation became smoother, the turbulence of the asteroid field lessened. Ethan felt the ship move more precisely, as if guided by a force beyond their controls. "We're slowing them down," Kalira said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. The freighter moved like a shadow through the rocks, weaving between obstacles with unnatural ease. The pursuers lost ground, their pursuit less accurate, their ship movements clumsy as Kalira's power disrupted their sensors. "They'll adapt," Ethan warned, his voice steady despite the mounting pressure. "We can't keep relying on this." "We don't have much choice," Kalira said. "This is my only defense." The gap widened between their small freighter and the pursuing ships, yet Ethan knew the momentary advantage wouldn't last. The aliens were relentless, trained to capture and control. They would push harder, sacrifice anything to regain what they'd lost. Ethan glanced back at the rear scanner. The pursuing ships were regrouping, coordinating a more aggressive approach. One of them launched a series of missiles, their streaks glowing against the dark void. "Brace for impact," Ethan shouted. Kalira's power surged again. She extended her hand, and a barrier formed between the missiles and their ship. A shimmering, pulsating wall of energy. The blasts collided, sending waves of heat through the cockpit as sparks flew from the console. "Hold steady," Ethan barked, his hands gripping the controls tightly. The ship shuddered, but they survived. For now. "They're closing in fast," Ethan said, his voice taut. "We're running out of time." Kalira closed her eyes briefly, focusing her energy. She could feel the strain taking its toll, her body growing weaker. The power she wielded wasn't meant to be used for extended periods, especially not while escaping an enemy fleet. "We'll find a safe haven," Kalira said softly, her voice fading as her energy waned. Ethan glanced at her, his expression hardening. "There has to be one." In the cockpit, silence fell for a moment except for the distant hum of the engines and the faint beeping of the scanner. Outside, the stars rushed by in a blur, but behind them, the enemy was closing in again. Ethan kept his hand steady on the controls, guiding the ship deeper into the asteroid field. The terrain became more treacherous, and their tiny freighter barely fit through the narrow gaps. "We'll make it," Ethan said firmly, though doubt lingered in his mind. Kalira leaned back into her seat, her breathing shallow. The light from her skin dimmed slightly, her powers flickering with exhaustion. Yet there was still a strength in her, a quiet resolve that defied even the odds. Ethan stared at the distant horizon, his jaw clenched. He wouldn't give up. Not now. Together, they would find a way. The asteroid field stretched endlessly before them, a vast expanse of floating rock and drifting debris. The freighter's engines hummed softly as it navigated through narrow gaps, propelled by the fragile energy barrier Kalira maintained with her fading strength. Ethan sat at the helm, his fingers moving across the controls with steady precision, but his mind was racing. They were still being pursued. The scanners flickered faintly, picking up distant signatures. Smaller ships spread out, searching for any trace of their escape route. Ethan knew they couldn't keep hiding forever. At some point, they'd have to face their pursuers head-on or find a place where they could truly be safe. "How long can you hold this?" Ethan asked, glancing over at Kalira. Her face was pale, her skin's glow dimming with each passing moment. She leaned back in her seat, her breath slow but steady. "Not much longer," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan gripped the controls tighter. He hated relying on her powers. It wasn't just the strain, it was the risk. The more she used her energy, the more vulnerable she became. And if they were caught, neither of them would survive. "We need to find a refuge," he said, "a place they won't follow." Kalira's gaze drifted to the stars outside the viewport. "There are places," she said softly, "but they're hidden, far from where anyone would think to look." "Hidden," Ethan repeated, his brow furrowing. "We'll take it." The freighter veered sharply around a massive asteroid, its engines flaring as they shot through the gap. Ethan's hands worked tirelessly, adjusting speed and course to avoid any potential traps set by the pursuing ships. They were fast, but not faster than the void. "Can you sense them?" Ethan asked after a while, glancing back at Kalira again. Her eyes were closed, her breathing shallow as she concentrated. "Still there. They're regrouping. They won't stop." Ethan nodded. "Then we'll stay one step ahead." For a time, silence fell over the ship once again. The only sound was the hum of the engines, the occasional crackle from the controls, and the distant, haunting echoes of the asteroids as they passed. Kalira's head lifted slightly, her eyes flickering open. "There's a place. A moon on the edge of the Harlan sector. It's uncharted, but I've been there before. They won't find us there." Ethan set his jaw, determination taking root. "Lead the way." With renewed purpose, Kalira directed him through the chaotic, shifting maze of asteroids toward the coordinates she knew. Her energy waned with every passing second, but the thought of what awaited them drove her forward. Minutes turned to hours, and the tension inside the freighter was palpable. Ethan's hands were steady, his mind alert to every sensor ping, every faint vibration of incoming threats. He trusted Kalira, but even trust could be strained when survival hung by a thread. Finally, the Harlan sector loomed in the distance, a cluster of forgotten moons and barren celestial bodies. The largest, a lifeless sphere bathed in eerie shadows, was their destination. "It's there," Kalira said, her voice weak but resolute. "The hidden moon. No records, no maps." Ethan piloted the freighter toward the rocky surface, scanning for a suitable landing spot. The ship shuddered slightly as they touched down on the uneven terrain, its engines fading into silence. Outside, the void stretched endlessly, and within moments, the stars disappeared behind the horizon. The silence returned, but this time, it was deeper, a peaceful, almost unnerving quiet. "We made it," Ethan whispered, allowing a small smile to cross his face. Kalira slumped back into her seat, her energy completely drained. Her skin barely shimmered now, and her breathing was shallow. "Safe," she said softly. "For now." Ethan's gaze softened as he looked at her. She'd saved them, but at what cost? The power she wielded was immense, but fragile. "Rest," he said gently. "I'll keep watch." Kalira closed her eyes, a faint nod the only response. She trusted him completely, and for the first time in days, she allowed herself to fall into a deep, exhausted slumber. Ethan remained at the helm, watching the empty darkness of space. The pursuit would come again, he knew. But for now, they had a fragile moment of peace, hidden, safe, in the shadows of the unknown. The moon's surface was a barren expanse of rocky crags and jagged formations, a stark contrast to the endless void above. Ethan sat in the pilot's seat, his fingers brushing against the controls with practiced ease. Outside the viewport, the stars shone faintly, their light dimmed by the shadowy terrain below. Kalira remained slumped in her seat, her energy drained from the constant use of her abilities. Her skin barely glowed now, and her breath came in slow, measured rhythms. Despite her exhaustion, her mind was alert, her senses tuned to every sound, every flicker of movement outside the ship. "We'll need to keep moving soon," Ethan said quietly, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, but his eyes betrayed the tension beneath. "They'll catch on eventually." Kalira lifted her head slowly, her eyes heavy but clear. "They'll find us again. It's inevitable." "No," Ethan said firmly. "Not if we keep moving. We'll keep them guessing." Kalira gave a faint nod, but her expression remained solemn. She knew the truth. Hiding wasn't a permanent solution. Their enemies were persistent, powerful, and well-connected. The odds were against them, and the longer they stayed, the more vulnerable they became. "I can't keep this up forever," Kalira admitted softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "The more I use my power, the harder it gets to control it." Ethan glanced at her, concern flickering in his eyes. "We'll find a way to fix that. We just need time." Kalira's lips pressed into a thin line. "Time is something we don't have." They sat in silence for a while, the only sounds being the hum of the ship's systems and the occasional faint crackle from the console. Ethan studied the moon's surface on the display, searching for the next safest location. The longer they stayed here, the higher the risk of detection. "They'll stop at nothing," Ethan said, breaking the stillness. "We need to move before they've traced us to this moon." Kalira shifted slightly, her head tilted toward the viewport again. Her eyes, though dim, were focused on the horizon. "There's something else," she said after a moment. "They've started using whispers." Ethan frowned. "Whispers?" Kalira nodded. "A connection. Through the void. They're speaking without words. They can sense where I've been." Ethan cursed under his breath. "Telepathy." "Not exactly," Kalira replied. "It's more of a pulse, a disturbance they're following." She closed her eyes for a moment, her brow furrowing. "They're getting closer." Ethan clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. "Then we move now." Kalira opened her eyes again, her expression determined despite her weariness. She knew their time on the moon was limited. The longer they waited, the more they would be hunted down. "We'll head for the next system," Ethan said, typing coordinates into the console. "One with minimal traffic." Kalira glanced at him, her voice calm but resolute. "And if we're found again?" Ethan's grip on the controls tightened. "Then we'll fight back. No more running." The ship's engines roared to life, propelling them forward into the cold void once more. The journey was not smooth. The strain of Kalira's powers weighed heavily on the ship's systems, forcing Ethan to work harder to keep them stable. But they couldn't afford to stop, not even for repairs. The scanners picked up movement, distant ships closing in fast. Ethan's breath quickened as he tightened his grip on the controls. "They're right behind us." Kalira held onto the seat's edge, her breathing shallow, her power flickering with every passing second. "We can't lose them again." "No," Ethan said firmly. "We won't." Suddenly, the ship jolted slightly, and alarms blared in the cockpit. Ethan's hands flew over the controls as he fought to stabilize the ship. "They've disabled our systems," Kalira shouted, her voice sharp with panic. "We've got incoming," Ethan barked, pushing every ounce of power from the engines to evade the attack. The ship twisted and turned, maneuvering through the void, but the enemy ships were relentless. Kalira's power surged again, this time draining her entirely. She collapsed onto the seat, her body trembling from the effort. I can't," she murmured weakly. "Hang on," Ethan shouted, his voice rising with urgency. He pulled every lever, every control, fighting to keep them alive. The ship groaned under the strain, but somehow they pushed through the onslaught. The freighter twisted and weaved, pulling further into the void as their enemies closed the gap. Ethan gritted his teeth, refusing to give up. "We'll make it." Kalira's vision blurred, her breath shallow, but her fingers instinctively reached out toward the controls. Her final act was to steady the ship, allowing Ethan to press forward with renewed strength. They escaped barely. Breathing hard, Ethan slumped back into his seat, staring at the scanner. The enemy ships were retreating, their pursuit momentarily halted. "We're not safe," Kalira whispered, her voice barely audible. "No," Ethan agreed, "but we'll keep moving. We'll keep fighting." Together, they would survive. The stars bowled into the void outside the cockpit as Ethan piloted the ship through yet another system. Kalira sat in the co-pilot's seat, her head resting against the backrest, her breath slow and measured. She had used the last of her energy, and now she was utterly drained. "We can't keep running forever," Ethan said, glancing at her as he guided the ship through a debris field. "They'll find us eventually." Kalira opened her eyes, a flicker of determination in her gaze. "Then we fight." Ethan's lips pressed into a thin line. "They've never had to deal with someone like you." Kalira gave a weak smile, but the strain was evident in her every movement. "They'll learn." The ship's console beeped softly, indicating an incoming transmission. Ethan reached for the comm controls, his fingers hovering just above them. "Incoming signal," he said, his voice steady. "From who?" Kalira sat upright, her vision clearing slightly as she focused on the signal. "It's not them," she said quietly. "It's something else." Ethan hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to be cautious. But he knew they needed allies, even if the cost was unknown. "Open it." The screen flickered to life, revealing the face of a humanoid figure, tall, with sharp features and piercing eyes. His voice was calm, almost soothing, but his presence held an air of authority. "I am Admiral Nethar," the figure said, his voice smooth and measured. "I know who you are, Kalira, and I know what they've done to you." Kalira's breath hitched. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice a little stronger than before. "We are those who seek to end the oppression of your people," Nethar replied. "We've been watching for a long time. And now, we're ready to fight." Ethan leaned forward, a frown creasing his brow. "You know what we've been through. What we've been running from." "Yes," Nethar said. "And we've gathered those who share a common enemy. Together, we can stand against them." Kalira's pulse quickened. "You've fought them before." "Many times," Nethar said. "We understand their tactics. We know their weaknesses, but we need you and your abilities to bring this fight to them." Ethan exchanged a glance with Kalira, weighing the risks. "And what's the price for this alliance?" Nethar's expression remained neutral. "Our only price is your freedom, and the safety of those who have been enslaved. Together, we can create a future where no one is hunted for who they are." Kalira's breath caught in her throat. For the first time in days, there was hope, a spark that flared within her, feeding her resolve. "We'll join you," she said softly, "but only if you're as powerful as you claim." Nethar inclined his head. "You have my word." With a flicker, the transmission ended. Ethan leaned back into his seat, a wave of relief washing over him. They weren't alone anymore. Kalira exhaled deeply, her strength slowly returning. "They'll come for us soon," she said, glancing toward Ethan. "We'll need to prepare." "We will," Ethan said firmly. "But this time, we're not running." The ship soared through the cosmos, heading toward a rendezvous with the unknown. Their enemies were still out there, closing in. Yet for the first time in a long while, there was a chance, a real chance, to take back control. "We'll fight together," Kalira murmured. "And we'll win." Ethan smiled, the weight lifting from his shoulders. Yes, together. The last stand had begun.